Today we're going to talk about the grading scale for hair loss, both the Norwood classification as well as the Ludwig classification, sort of put into perspective for you. There are really two principal types of hair loss classification schema, one proposed by Hamilton, one proposed by Norwood. Really today most people use the Norwood classification, and through initial study they found that the Hamilton and Norwood classification schema actually correlate pretty well. So we're going to talk about the Norwood classification for male pattern baldness, and it is in the website, but I think it's easier if I explain it verbally to you through this video. So we're going to talk about all from type 1 to type 7. Type 1 basically is extremely minor frontal temporal recession, almost none or none. So it's essentially a non-balding scalp. It's prepubescent, and some men do maintain that throughout their lifetime. In Caucasian men, only about 4% maintain a Norwood 1 classification. A Norwood 2 classification, you're beginning to have some frontal temporal recession. You may have a little bit of thinness across the central mid-forelock region, but essentially this is a very, very small degree of frontal temporal recession. There's already a triangular degree of recession, but this is not considered one of the stages of baldness per se. The technical specification is that a line drawn through the external auditory canal, about 2 centimeters in front of that triangular recession does not recede beyond that line. A type 3 Norwood is the first classification of true baldness that would necessitate or would benefit from a hair transplantation. This is going to be a much deeper frontal temporal recession. Again, you may have some further loss also in the front as well, but the hallmark of it is a deeper recession in the frontal temporal recess, where that line is actually exceeding a line that's lying 2 centimeters anterior to the external auditory canal, if you want to be more technically specific. There's a variation of this called type 3 vertex, in which the person has that same degree of recession, but also has beginning some vertex loss. So you can have some vertex loss and still be considered a type 3. That would be a type 3 vertex. And interestingly, about only 10% of people below the age of 39 have a type 3 vertex. It's mostly people that are above 39 years of age that have a type 3 vertex. When you get into type 4, there's a greater degree of recession, where there's more blunting of this frontal scalp. It goes further back. There's a deeper recession in the frontal temporal angle, and now there's vertex alopecia, or hair loss back here, to the point where there's still a significant bridge dividing the two areas of hair loss, but now there is actually a bridge that's dividing the two. When you get to type 5, you're getting significant alopecia, significant hair loss, where that bridge is now almost entirely obliterated, but there's still a little bit of hair that's still remaining. It's almost sporadic, if you will, and there's further recession of this lateral hump temporal region, and further recession across here. So it's from type 5 through type 7. If you're looking down on the person's head, you're going to see a horseshoe as a defining element of it. Type 6, that little tiny sporadic bridge of hair between the vertex or crown and the frontal mid-scalp is now completely gone. There's no hair between the two. And there's further recession of the frontal temporal, temporal recession going downward, as well as further back in the vertex region. So it's now a true horseshoe, but the horseshoe is still maintaining a pretty high fringe. So if you've got a high fringe, you can still have, you'll have a 6, and you're not quite at a 7. A 7, there's so much loss that it's basically all the way down, where you don't have a high fringe, and you even at this point, and you can have it earlier on too, is you're starting to get what's called retrograde loss, where the hair around the nape of the neck is also receding upward. The area right above the ear is receding upward, so you're having a very thin horseshoe that's left. That would be the most advanced stage of hair loss, and in most cases in a stage 7 or a type 7, you're not going to be able to get a complete coverage of the entire head. Even in a 6, is going to be very difficult, and the crown is usually an area that you can't quite get on a 6. But from 5s and forward, if you have good density, because that's the other thing, it's not just the degree of hair loss, it's how much donor density you have for us to be able to move forward and transplant, with the caveat of thinking about your age. If you're having a type 3 hair loss and you're 60 years old, it's going to be very easy to transplant that. If you're 20 years old, I probably wouldn't do it, because you're going to have some advancing hair loss, and we've got to make sure that we have enough donor supply to transplant that area. Norwood also found a classification scheme that was is found in a smaller subset of men. That's what they call a type A variation. essentially the hallmark of this is instead of having vertex loss, you're actually having and a frontal temporal recession, just having just a straight line recession going back. And this would be something like if you think of George Costanza on Seinfeld, he's got a type A variation where it's just receding backwards first. And once it gets far enough back that you're getting into the vertex, you really can't make a distinction between the regular classification in Norwood and this type A variation. So the type A variation, as just to reiterate, there's two major characteristics and two minor characteristics. The two major characteristics, as mentioned, one is the fact that there's going to be just a straight line recession, and the other major characteristic, besides a straight line recession of the hairline, is you're going to have no involvement of the vertex. The minor characteristics is that you could have in the area of recession little areas of denudation where you're having some little hairs that are left as a sort of a scatter or ghost zone. And the other thing is you're going to maintain a very high fringe, a wider, higher fringe than you would in a classic Norwood classification scheme. Let's go through each of those. There's only type 2 through type 5, because the 1 is really just there's no variation with the normal hair. In other words, non-recession. And beyond a 5, as I said, and once you start getting into vertex loss, you can't distinguish it between a classic 6 and 7 for Norwood. So type 2A, you're getting a recession coming back this way, and the same hallmark that was in a type 2, you're not getting it past the 2 centimeters anterior to the external auditory canal. As that's receding back, the interesting thing is it looks like significant more hair loss in a type 2 and in a classic Norwood because you don't have that frontal here, that frontal area here. There's no frame there. It's completely receded backwards. In a type 3A, you're actually having enough loss that it could actually meet the mid-coronal line, which is a greater degree of recession potentially than a classic 3. So you're getting more recession even up to this line here. But remember, no vertex and almost a straight line recession in this type A variation. When you get into a type 4, you're past the mid-coronal line. You're actually past behind this mid-coronal. That's the area, the right drawn through the ears like this. In a type 5A, which is the most severe form, you're going all the way back to the point where you're just at the start of the crown. So it's falling back this way. And remember, the crown is the area, it's almost like the posterior hairline where the scalp transitions from a horizontal to a vertical plane. So that transition zone, that's the farthest back. Because remember, once you start dipping into the vertex, you can't make a distinction between a type 6 and 7 classic Norwood. So that's basically the major types of male pattern baldness using the Norwood classification scheme. There's also other variations you can think about that are out there, such as diffuse pattern loss, where you're just getting a lot of hair loss throughout the entire hairline with or without preservation of the hairline. And that's more like what a female pattern baldness would be, and we're going to talk about that more in a moment. There's other types of hair loss, such as senile alopecia, which essentially is just diffuse thinning that occurs in both men and women as they get older. It doesn't have to happen for everyone, but the older you get, there's a higher prevalence of senile alopecia. There is different types of preservation of the frontal forelock with further recession. If you think of David Letterman, he's got a stronger frontal forelock, but there's a recession that goes around that. That's another type of hair loss that can occur, but it's much less prevalent than the Norwood or the Norwood type A's variation. And then when we talk about women, women can have 3 principal types of hair loss. One is the classic Ludwig pattern. As you look at the website, you'll see those drawings. In a Ludwig 1, you're getting hair loss which is diffuse with or without preservation of the frontal hairline, and then that becomes more moderate, and you can really see through the hair area in a Ludwig 2. By the time you hit a Ludwig 3, there is significant diffuse loss where it's almost basically bald across the central scalp, and that is something that you really would necessitate looking at a metabolic workup and finding out if there's something else as a causative factor for this significant degree of hair loss in a female. And the key hallmark of the Ludwig is it's a central centrifugal loss that occurs over the mid-scalp area here that may or may not have preservation of the hairline. The other one is you could have a Norwood or Hamilton type of loss in terms of like a male pattern baldness, that can also occur in women. So women can also exhibit a degree of male pattern baldness, and interestingly enough, they can also preserve more or less the frontal hairline. The thought behind that is that the aromatase levels that are in there can preserve the hairline. And sometimes in men, if there's a higher aromatase or whatever may be the cause, they can also preserve a hairline and have diffuse thinning behind that frontal hairline. And then the final type of hair loss is noted by Olson in 1994, where there's what's called a Christmas tree pattern. Essentially what this is, if the person bends her head downward, you'll see a Christmas tree pattern on parting the hair out this way. Olson believes that the majority of hair losses actually fall into this Christmas tree type of pattern, where you're seeing this, either with or without preservation of the hairline again, this pattern where the frontal area, as the hair is parted, is more lost and then less and less lost as you go backwards. And there's just a ragged border as you go, particularly going posteriorly backwards. You can also have what's called lacunae, which Unger found in 1987, which are little spots of hair loss in a female. And those are basically the three types of classifications of female pattern baldness, but of course you can have other variations as well, just like in male pattern baldness. They may not fit the classic Norwood or Hamilton scheme. Hopefully that was a nice short video on just having to understand where you may fall in your type of Norwood loss as you come to see us in consultation.